The My Card takes charge on Segaiden.
So I'm taking it back. I'm taking them all back.
Everyone loves a great story, and everyone loves a tidy narrative arc. This episode of Segaiden delivers nicely. Well, maybe nice is the wrong word to use. While the three games we see this week have a lot going for them, they do not share any kind of sense of mercy. All three are insanely difficult and appear to have been built on the principle that video games should make you feel bad about yourself. Another arcade port, Zoom 909, has the poor fortune to have already been done and done better on the ColecoVision. Bearing the name Buck Rogers' Planet of Zoom, the Coleco version is one of the rare instances of someone doing a Sega game better than Sega themselves. This particular version of the game is a bit of a belly flop, which seems a shame. Like Monaco GP, Zoom 909 holds a fairly important place in Sega history. This time as a precursor to the company's superscalar technology. Zoom 909 sits directly at the midpoint between Turbo and Space Harrier. You control a starfighter that rushes forward into the screen as enemies and hazards alike appear in the distance and rush forward themselves, growing in size as they do. Zoom 909 debuted in arcades back in 1982 on the company's VCO object hardware, which prefigured the proper superscaling hardware that made hang-on possible right around the time Zoom 909 hit SG-1000. The VCO object concept revolved around scaling objects in simulated 3D space, a style that would become a trademark of Sega's coin-op business in the back half of the 80s. Here in 1985, however, Zoom 909 primarily serves to demonstrate how badly behind Sega's current arcade tech the SG-1000 lagged. If you needed convincing that the Mark III upgrade waiting in the wings was desperately needed, as the prospect of exhilarating new arcade smash Hang-On making its way into home conversion ticked away in the background, Zoom 909's paltry performance on SG-1000 made for a pretty convincing sales pitch. I suppose if Buck Rogers' Planet of Zoom didn't exist for Coleco Adam, Zoom 909 wouldn't seem quite so hard a pill to swallow. But as much trouble as Coleco soldiered through in its efforts to bring the Adam to market, that system had shipped in 1984 at last, and Buck Rogers appeared alongside it as its pack-in software showcase. The Adam game featured smoother scrolling, more colorful and clearly drawn enemies, more fluid sprite movement, better enemy AI, and less awkward hazard scaling. It also offered a sort of clarity of purpose lacking here. Zoom 909 plays a good deal like a reverse take on Atari's Star Wars arcade game, which had appeared in arcades the same year. Both Atari and Sega had attempted to create a convincing 3D space combat simulation, albeit through different means. Where Sega went with fluid sprite scaling, Atari used mathematically plotted vector graphics. Either way, the influence of the original Star Wars, the movie, is extremely evident here in this game, as Zoom 909, like so many space games of this era, attempted to recreate the thrilling Death Star trench run sequence in playable form. I suppose it's only fair that the game ended up wearing the Buck Rogers brand in the West, given that Star Wars had been heavily influenced by the vintage Buck Rogers serials George Lucas watched as a kid. When Glenn A. Larson revived the brand to ride the coattails of Star Wars mania with a new TV series, it simply seemed like cosmic chickens coming home to roost. Zoom 909 features a trench run, a battle across the surface of a planet, and finally a showdown with an enemy carrier. In the trench run scenes, you need to avoid collisions with walls and enemy vessels while gathering fuel. Yes, in keeping with the game's oblique Sega racing lineage, Zoom 909 makes use of a fuel mechanic that requires you to keep your tank topped off in order to continue playing. The concept works pretty well in this game, as your natural fuel drain over time doesn't pose a huge and serious threat on its own. The real danger of the fuel drain mechanic comes into play if you struggle with combat. You have effectively unlimited lives in Zoom 909. Smashing into a wall or enemy fighter doesn't dock you a reserve ship, only fuel. Once you run out of fuel, the game ends, no matter how many lives you have or haven't lost. Fortunately, fuel is pretty easy to collect. You simply fly over the blue spherical fuel icons with no agonizingly precise safari racing stops necessary. All of this carries over into the SG-1000 version and then some. As with the console's version of Zaxxon, Sega added some new material and concepts for this home adaptation, including, but not limited to, the inclusion of background music. Whereas Zaxxon played a bit like a remix of the arcade original and Super Zaxxon, Zoom 909 straight up adds a new stage here that plays unlike any other part of the game. On one hand, you have to admire the extra effort the company invested into this version. On the other, the new material actually works to the detriment of the overall package. Before the final carrier sequence, Zoom 909 switches over from a behind-the-camera perspective to a top-down mode in which you navigate a free-scrolling grid and gun down enemies. From a technical perspective, this is a remarkable achievement for SG-1000. A legitimate free-scrolling scene, something that to this point, the more powerful Famicom hardware had only pulled off properly with Raid-on Bungling Bay. From a gameplay perspective, it's a disaster. Not only does the space grid sequence demand players take a completely different approach to space combat in a game not originally designed for it, it's also unflinchingly difficult. The top-down combat makes use of inertial physics, akin to asteroids or, if you really want to go back, computer space. When you fire your thrusters, your fighter will continue moving in that direction until you rotate in reverse. Unlike asteroids though, this space is both visually confusing due to the dense background grid and abstract hazards, and it's also, well, dense. You're surrounded by foes or something, it's hard to tell, in all directions, and they home in on you immediately to crash into you and drain your fuel. I've made several attempts to complete this stage with zero luck. Certainly it doesn't help that the objective for this sequence, which appears to involve collecting Capcom-style POW icons, are incredibly unclear. You can find videos of what is clearly emulator-based gameplay online if you're curious about the space battle that lies beyond the grid. Zoom 909 is unfortunately not great on SG-1000. I'd much rather play the Atom version, which lacks the awful grid sequence. But you do have to admire Sega's attempts to make the console punch above its weight class, with some interesting technical achievements here, even if you don't like the results. Next up, the SG-1000 sees another American computer classic in the form of Choplifter. Choplifter appeared on pretty much every platform under the sun back in the day, and just about every one of them worked more or less the same. This version is no different. Choplifter was one of several American games Sega licensed from Brutish in competition with Hudson, or Jalico I guess, since that was the studio that would publish the Famicom version of the game. Basically what I'm saying is that Brutish was not big on monogamy and licensing. We have of course seen Choplifter on NES Works Gaiden in the form of its Atari 7800 conversion. The 7800 conversion played quite faithfully to the Apple II original, albeit with more colorful visuals. For the Sega adaptation, you might reasonably expect a rendition more in line with the arcade version, which, like the SG-1000 game, was also a 1985 release and created by Sega. Surprisingly, however, that's not the case. Sega based the adaptation closely after the Apple original, rather than their own more elaborate coin-op interpretation. Sega's Choplifter arcade game wouldn't come home for another year on the next generation rebuild of the SG-1000, the Mark III or Master System. Here, Sega sticks with the vintage strain. But I'm not sure whether that's because the SG-1000 card came along before the arcade port was sorted out, or simply because Sega felt the console couldn't handle that lush work, which inaugurated the company's new System 2 hardware spec. In any case, this is the classic version of Choplifter, meaning it works exactly as expected. You pilot a rescue helicopter, making forays into enemy airspace to liberate a few dozen hostages from prisoner of war camps. Your objective for the game is to bring all the hostages safely home by ferrying half a dozen of them back to your home base at a time. Any hostage that dies, whether by being killed by enemy fire or by simply being on board your chopper when it's downed, counts against your total. As with most console versions of Choplifter, the SG-1000 rendition lacks support for the Apple II's analog control stick, which had been integral to the original game design. That omission naturally makes this version ridiculously difficult. The game begins easily enough. Your initial sortie into enemy territory catches your foes off guard, so it's pretty easy to collect and shuttle home the first batch of prisoners. However, with each POW deposit you make, the difficulty escalates further, with jet fighters and aerial mines entering the scrum and more tanks rolling into the scene. I've played a lot of different Choplifter adaptations, and this might actually be the most difficult of the lot. Enemies are incredibly aggressive, with tanks going out of their way to disregard the Geneva Convention and shell POWs before you can gather them, and aerial mines actively seeking out your chopper. On top of that, the SG-1000 game undermines your ability to strategically gather hostages from the most remote encampment first, a tactic that normally reduces your risk and exposure to hostile fire once the difficulty picks up. You can only collect hostages from the prison camp nearest to your territory in your first sortie, meaning you have to fly to the more remote outposts later, as endless waves of jets and mines try to take you down. It's a solid conversion of the game, though the difficulty level makes it deeply demoralizing. Ultimately, its value is really only undermined by the fact that Sega shipped a more nuanced version of the game to arcades at the same time that this hit the stores, and a proper home port of that coin-op would appear on SG-1000's evolved form soon after. Okay, now this is more like it. Pitfall II, like Choplifter and Zoom 909, is extremely difficult on SG-1000, but it's a really interesting and really well-made take on Activision's groundbreaking exploratory classic. Unlike Choplifter, which appears to have come to SG-1000 in a vacuum where the existence of a superior Sega-coded arcade version of that work didn't exist, Pitfall II sits at a sort of midpoint between the Atari 2600 original and its Sega coin-op overhaul. The original Pitfall II showed up over on Metroidvania Works because it allowed players to freely explore a sprawling contiguous space. Sega's Pitfall II for arcades transformed Activision's creation into a somewhat simpler action game that seems to have been inspired to a certain degree by Spelunker, adding a more linear platform action intro at the beginning and introducing new features like sloped surfaces. The SG-1000 release falls somewhere in the middle. It has a more arcade-like style to it than the Atari game, but it reincorporates a fair amount of the exploration aspect, albeit in a compact, streamlined form. As in every other version of the game, Pitfall Harry sets out to acquire treasures here. Unlike in every other version, however, Pitfall Harry only gets 3 chances to comb the world and find those treasures. It's like Revolver Ocelot said.
There are no continues, my friend.
The original Activision creation bucked trends of the era by giving players infinite lives. When Harry did something that should have constituted a fatality, the game would whisk him back to a checkpoint and simply dock his score. Since the point of the original Pitfall II was to earn a perfect score, that penalty hurt. You could complete the game, but end up with a terrible score. So players had an incentive to learn the ropes and master the game without constantly being forced to start over again from the beginning. The arcade version featured a 3 lives system with continues, as well as a short timer that could be topped up by collecting treasures. On SG-1000 you get 3 lives and that's it. Add to that some slightly squirrely controls and far from generous collision detection, and you have a game that, like the other 2 arcade ports seen in this episode, offers no mercy whatsoever. This is Sega at its most ruthless. This doesn't make it a bad game, just another wildly difficult one. Pitfall II itself is compelling enough, and this port is creative and ambitious enough, that you can easily imagine players investing their energy into mastering this sprawling digital world, by far the largest yet seen on SG-1000. Certainly it's better and more fair than Super Pitfall. Despite its rough edges, Pitfall II's scope and character action feel closer to the standard you'd expect from a Master System or Mark III release than anything yet seen on SG-1000 besides Flicky. In fact, according to blogger Nicole Express, Sega clearly felt this way too. The company released a revised version of Pitfall II for MyCard, designed to look better with the Mark III's graphics chip than a basic SG-1000 release would. While the Mark III would be built around the SG-1000's core processor, it would also contain an entirely new video system. Sega built backward compatibility with SG-1000 into the Mark III, but SG-1000 games looked garish and oversaturated on the upgraded hardware. You can actually see this in action in my earliest Segaiden videos, which were recorded with the Master System Mark III palette before I understood how to capture SG-1000 games with their intended palette. And so basically, the version 1.1 release of Pitfall II softens the garishness of the game on the Mark III to give it a slightly more muted color scheme in line with its appearance on the original hardware, which suggests that Sega knew this was a game good enough for fans to continue picking away at it well after the Mark III had arrived on the scene. Next time on Segaiden, we hit some puzzle masterpieces.